Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to work on a lazy afternoon, quilting it on the long arm. Now on the instructions for the lazy afternoon, they said it probably wasn't recommended for long arming because this quilt is reversible. The front and back are about the same size, but that really is an easy issue to overcome. Just to refresh your memory, this is what one of my original ones looked like. And I didn't create the pattern. The pattern is from American Quilt Retailer, who've graciously allowed us to print or provide this pattern for you free on our website. So if you look up Lazy Afternoon on the Urban Elementz website, you'll be able to see a PDF download. But the quilt is reversible, so the back is a reverse image of the front. Fairly simple, can be cut and pieced in an afternoon, and depending on your quilting method you can get it quilted pretty quick too, because it's not a huge quilt. Now I've already made my top and back, and really they're interchangeable because this is a reversible quilt, but I'm using this particular side as my top because I thought the quilting pattern would show up a little bit better on it. Now it's going to be the same on the front or back, but as we're viewing it during the quilting process, I thought it would show up a little bit more on the gray with the red thread. Now I haven't heard too many comments other than a lot of people thought Ohio State was the best pro football team. So I'm glad that I chose this fabric and that so many of you agreed with that assertion. So this is going to be the top of the quilt and this is the back. Now, if you are going to send this to the long arm, I would recommend that you do this step yourself. What I did was just add some fabric on to the sides and top of this quilt so that it can be accommodated on the long arm machine. On the top and bottom, I only added a 3-inch strip, and I just used black. Where I got the fabric, whenever I use 108-inch goods for the back of a quilt, I always save those leftover strips because they come in handy for things like this. So I had one piece of fabric that I was able to get all these strips from. So I have a 3-inch strip on the top and bottom, and that's going to help me get it attached to the leaders. And 3 inches is plenty to keep the head of my machine, the sewing needle, away from the pins that I'm going to attach this quilt to the leaders. Now on the two sides I used wider strips. I used 6-inch strips so that I can use the bungee cords on the side and they don't get caught up hitting the side of the machine. The sides always take more than the top or bottom. Usually we say 5 or 6 inches all the way around, but I skimmed it a little bit on this one. So this is going to go on first, and this is the back. And I made sure to mark the center of the quilt utilizing the body of the quilt, not this excess fabric. I really want to make sure I have the center of the quilt because I'm going to do the same when I put the top on there, and I want to get these lined up as closely as possible. Now I'm going to tell you, you're never, ever, ever going to get these lined up identical. They're going to be stretched taut in different strengths with the top and the back. There's no way to get it on a long arm to have the front and back match on this. So don't make yourself crazy, please. If you really want to avoid the whole topic of it, you could have one going up and down and the other one going sideways so that there's no way that the design has to match. Don't make yourself crazy. This isn't the quilt for it. This is a very friendly, easy to do, beginner friendly quilt. It's a quick quilt, it's a charity quilt, it's a quick gift quilt. Don't make it complicated. Don't knock yourself out. I know that adding a strips of fabric on seems like a big extra step. It just took me about 15 or 20 minutes. If you're going to ask the long armer to quilt one of these, you go ahead and put these strips on and don't add on more work to your long armer. Give it to them the way that they need it so they can pop it on the machine quick and get your product back to you. And all of that could just be trimmed off. I suppose if you wanted to, you could try and figure out a way to maybe like fold these over as the binding. I'm not doing anything crazy like that. I'm not going to do it. Once this quilt's finished, I'm going to cut these strips back off and I'm going to save them, and I could use them again if I do other Lazy Afternoon quilts. I'm not going to try and just base the edges because I don't want to have the quilting stop very edge of the quilt. If it quilts off onto this, you're not going to be able to use the unbasting of the edges and save them, so don't make yourself crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and load this. I have my center mark at the top and bottom, and I've already got some red to burgundy thread. I've got more of a burgundy on one side and a redder on the other. Scarlet and gray, the true colors. I'm not using gray thread at all on this, but I'm going to go ahead and get it loaded, and then we can get the design pulled up. I'm using a Jessica Schick pattern today. It's called Footballs and Stars, and I thought that was appropriate. And that's all there is to this portion. We're just going to go ahead and get this loaded, and then we can get started quilting. I'm going to start designing my quilt pattern for the Lazy Afternoon. This is the Ohio State, which many of you have said was the best team. So I'm glad I did Ohio State fabric. I'm going to hit Design Sew, Start New, and then I have a work in progress. Do I want to replace it? Yes. Permanently erase? Yes. And it's going to reset my clock because the IQ keeps track of your stitch count and your time. So I'm going to select Pantograph, enter manually the size of the quilt. Because this quilt hangs way beyond the stitching area, I have to do it manually. I couldn't possibly move the machine to map it. So I'm going to do, the width is going to be 65, and I'm going to do 69, which is longer than what I need for the length, and hit continue. I can always adjust those numbers down. You really can't adjust them up after you start. So I'm going to hit finished, and then I'm going to go to my downloads and hit F for football. And the name of the design I'm using is Football Stars. And I'm going to select that twice for the even and odd rows. In one of the other videos, I showed you how you could use two different Panto designs to increase the complexity of the quilting design or the aesthetic appeal. So you could look at that if you wanted to. There's not really a huge gap on this particular pattern, but I'm going to reduce it a little bit. And now my pattern height is 12 inches. The original pattern height was 10 inches. So I'm going to reduce this a little bit to get closer to the original 10. So we have about 7.5 rows. So I'm going to go ahead and hit finished. My transition type is continuous. That means when it sews off of the quilt, it's just going to keep sewing down until it gets to this next part of the design and then stitch back on. I've already basted the two edges of this quilt and the top, but in this particular case today, I'm just floating this. I didn't roll up the entire length of this quilt. Some people will say that's lazy. Some people just do that as standard practice. I don't mind floating smaller quilts. Personally, I would not float a very large quilt. So I'm going to hit accept, and I'm going to hit sew quilt. Select the first patterns, this one up here. Hit continue, sew quilt again. And this is the point where the machine engages the motor wheels, and now the head is not free moving. The only way to get it to be free moving again is to hit restart or manual mode. Okay, now I have my bobbin thread pulled up, so I'm going to put my machine in manual mode and hit start. Now I know you can't see any of the action right now, so I'll reposition the camera and then we'll start again. I knew when I started, when I selected a design that was about 10.5 inches, that I was going to have to roll up the quilt after each row. My throat space here can only accommodate 19.25 inches of design space, and that's without my ruler base. So a 10.5 inch design I'm only going to do once, because 2 rows of it would be 21 inches. So I've done the design twice. I'm going to roll up the quilt and realign, and we'll get to the 3rd row. There's all kinds of ways to do things with the IntelliQuilter, and sometimes you could riff a little bit on your own style. I have to roll up the quilt and then realign it, and so what I'm going to do first is hit sew quilt. Because I didn't do panto sequencing, I'm doing this row by row. So these 3 rows are what I've already sewn. It's asking me to select the next pattern, so I'm going to select this one. At this point I don't have to do anything with the swapping endpoints, but I can if I want. What I'm going to do, my crosshairs are exactly where the design finished, and I pulled up my bobbin thread already and cut it. So I'm going to take my crosshairs, which is also an indication of where my needle is, and I'm going to line it up to the highest point in the next row I'm going to sew. And so I'm just going to choose a football, top of the football, which is the highest point of the design, and drop my needle. So right now my needle is at the highest point of the design of the next row that I'm going to sew, and my needle is buried into the quilt. So now I can go ahead and take my side tension off, whatever method you're using for that, and then I can roll the quilt up. The reason I do it this way, I want to make sure that the highest point of the design is able to stitch out without getting an obstruction notice from the take-up bar or the dead bar. If I have chosen the highest point of the design, I know nothing's going to sew higher than that, and if I roll up the quilt to that point, I know that I'm going to be able to stitch that out. After I've done that, I can go ahead and reapply the tension to the quilt, make sure my batting is flat. After I get the tension done, then I'll go ahead and base the edges of my quilt, making sure the quilt is flat, and then I can go ahead and realign. When I rolled up the quilt, I was focused on the next row, and that's how I used the needle to give me the furthest back position so I wouldn't get an obstruction. Now that I'm going to realign, I need to focus on the row that I just finished quilting. So I'm going to select the zoom off button, and now it's zoom on. So I can zoom in, And the zoom functions are a lot like Simon Says. You have to do them exactly in the order they say. Simon says you could zoom in. Simon says you could zoom in. Or you're not going to get to where you need to be. So I'm going to go right to the bottom of this star. I'm going to move the head of my machine right to the bottom of that star. And then I'm going to hit zoom off. Now I can go ahead and select that point as my reference point. You cannot select that point as long as you're in the zoom screen. So I hit continue and OK. Now I can restart and go back to the start of the next row and select sew again. This is the side that we quilted as the top, and the design shows up really well on here, which is primarily why I wanted to use the gray side for the top so that the quilting would show up really well. What I want to do is flip it over, and I have not trimmed it yet. This is the top. I want to show you more of the bottom. That we've only gone over just a little bit in the stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this. I'm going to trim the black off, which I added just to make the backing piece of this large enough to fit onto the frame. So I'll go ahead and trim this and then flip it over so you can see what both sides look like. Now what I'm going to do, you could just trim along the edge. Just trim this off and do the other side. But also what I like to do sometimes is measure from a seam line. So I could measure a consistent measurement over. And this was supposed to be around 10 inches wide. I could go maybe 9 3/4. I'll take it upstairs and look at it. But if you measure from this line over, you'll get a very accurate representation of the size overall. But you also could easily just use the rotary cutter and ruler and line it up on the seam and cut that off. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So I trimmed off the one side. You're almost always going to have to trim this from both sides because it's never going to line up perfectly, and the front and back generally are the same size. But other than that, it's not that big of a deal. I trimmed it from the front side first. Well, actually I trimmed it the back side and trimmed the black off that I used to get it onto the frame, and then I went, turned it over and saw if there's any places I need to trim on the front. So I just threw it on the floor, set it, threw it around. You can see it comes out pretty quick. It's a really great reversible quilt. You could use a great number of teams on here if you want to do a sports theme one, or you could do, for pity's sake, you could do Broadway plays if you could find the fabric, Marvel Comics. You could do any kind of charity quilt with them. They could be patriotic or not. Easter, Valentine's, like the first one I made. But they're really a great quilt pattern. It's a lot of fun to do, and it is really quick. I had a lot of fun doing this. I've been wanting to do this particular pattern for a while. The only thing you have left to do is make the binding. Now, in the fabric requirements, they have enough fabric for one of the two colors to be the binding for that. I think I'm going to go ahead and use the gray. And because I'm a little bit behind, a friend volunteered to both make the binding and apply it for this one for me. So I'm going to take advantage of that. So I really appreciate American Quilt Retailer for allowing us to share this pattern with you. It is an older pattern, but I think it's a real gem. So thanks for stopping by the studio today and watching us sew this up. The quilting pattern we used was Footballs and Stars by Jessica Schick. She's been long arming and designing digital designs for a long time. She is one of the Urban Elementz designers. So thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other, and keep quilting.